There's a moment most people will never notice because it doesn't look dangerous. It looks like calm. It looks like someone who used to care deeply suddenly becoming quieter, more controlled, harder to read. No more over-explaining. No more emotional reactions. Just silence and observation. But beneath that calm, something powerful is happening. Because when a person who understands emotions better than anyone else stops reacting to them, they don't lose that ability, they sharpen it. And that's what makes this moment so unsettling. You're not watching someone break. You're watching someone switch from feeling everything to choosing what they feel, when they feel it, and who gets access to it. Once that switch happens, the same empathy that once made them gentle can make them dangerously precise. That's the moment we're talking about. Empathy is often praised as one of the most powerful human traits, and in many ways, it is. The ability to understand what someone else is feeling, to step into their emotional world and genuinely connect, can build trust, deepen relationships, and create a sense of meaning that few other qualities can provide. But there's a part of empathy that rarely gets talked about, and that's what happens when it exists without boundaries. At first, it doesn't seem like a problem. In fact, it feels like a strength. You're the one people come to when they're overwhelmed, confused, or hurting. You listen longer than most. You notice what others miss. You can pick up on subtle emotional shifts even when nothing is being said out loud. And because you can feel what others are going through, helping them feels natural, almost automatic. Over time, though, something starts to shift beneath the surface. When you constantly absorb other people's emotions, mind and body don't always distinguish between what's yours and what isn't. Stress, anxiety, frustration. If you're exposed to it enough, it starts to feel like your own. You carry conversations long after they've ended. You replay situations in your head, thinking about how someone else felt, what they needed, what you could have done differently. And slowly, without realizing it, you start allocating more of your energy outward than inward. This is where the imbalance begins, because empathy, on its own, doesn't have a natural stopping point. It doesn't tell you when you've given enough. It doesn't remind you to check in with yourself. Without boundaries, it becomes an open channel, one where emotions flow in freely, but very little is filtered or managed. It might seem like compassion. What it actually creates is emotional overload. At first, you might just feel tired, really drained. Then, at some point, you begin to feel something more complicated, something harder to admit, resentment, because you don't care, but because caring has become exhausting. You start noticing patterns. You're always available, always supported. You understand others, but feel misunderstood yourself. You give people space to express their emotions, but struggle to find that same space when you need it. And even if no one is intentionally taking advantage of you, dynamic becomes unbalanced. The problem is most empathetic people don't address this early. They push through it. They tell themselves, this is just who I am, or people need me, or it's not a big deal. But every time they ignore their own limits, reinforce the idea that their role is to carry more than they should. And that pressure doesn't disappear, it builds. Eventually, your system starts looking for relief. But instead of finding healthy ways to release that emotional weight, it often comes out in subtle shifts. You become less patient, more guarded. You start withdrawing, even if you don't fully understand why. Conversations that once felt meaningful start to feel draining. Situations you used to handle with ease now feel overwhelming. is the cost of empathy without boundaries. It turns something that should be a strength into something that slowly works against you. What makes this especially challenging is that the solution feels counterintuitive. Setting boundaries can feel uncomfortable, even wrong. You might worry about disappointing people, coming across as distant, or losing the very connection that makes empathy meaningful in the first place. But in reality, boundaries don't weaken empathy. They protect it, create structure. They give you the ability to decide when to engage and when to step back. They help you separate what you can support from what you cannot carry. And most importantly, they allow you to remain present without becoming overwhelmed, because true empathy isn't about absorbing everything. It's about understanding without losing yourself in the process. When you learn to set limits, something interesting happens. You don't stop caring. You start caring more effectively. Your energy becomes more intentional. Your support becomes more sustainable. Instead of feeling drained after helping someone, you feel steady because you're no longer giving from a place of depletion. Without boundaries, empathy becomes self-destruction over time. Um, with them, it becomes one of the most controlled and powerful tools you can have. The difference isn't in how much you feel. It's in how well you manage what you feel and what you choose to carry. At first, resentment doesn't show up in obvious ways. It doesn't announce itself or take over your behavior overnight. In fact, often hides behind good intentions. You continue to listen, continue to help, you continue to show up for people just like you always have. On the surface, nothing seems different. But internally, something has started to shift. It usually begins with small, unnoticeable moments. A conversation where you feel unheard. A situation where you give more than you receive. In a time when you needed support but didn't get it. And instead of addressing it, you brush it aside. You tell yourself it's not worth bringing up. You convince yourself you're being understanding, patient, mature, and in isolation, those decisions don't seem harmful. They don't disappear either. Every time you suppress how you actually feel, you store it. Every time you choose silence over honesty, add another layer. And because empathetic people are highly skilled at justifying others' behavior, now they become even better at ignoring their own emotional signals. This is where resentment starts to form. Not from a lack of care, but from a lack of expression. You're still showing up for others, but you're no longer showing up for yourself in the same way. Your needs don't vanish. They just go unspoken. And over time, unspoken needs have a way of turning into unacknowledged frustration. What makes this especially complicated is that nothing feels dramatic enough to confront. There's no single moment you can point to and say, that's where everything went wrong. Instead, it's a pattern, subtle, consistent, and easy to overlook, but your mind doesn't overlook it. It starts keeping track, not in a loud or obvious way, but quietly in the background. You begin to notice imbalances more quickly. You start recognizing when you're the one adjusting, accommodating, or understanding again. And even if you don't say anything out loud, internally, there's a growing awareness that something isn't fair. At this stage, many people double down on their original behavior. They try to be even more patient, even more understanding. They believe that if they just give a little more, things will balance out. But this only deepens the problem, because now the gap between what they give and what they receive becomes even wider. Gap is where resentment grows strongest. Eventually, it starts to leak out, but not in direct ways. Become less enthusiastic in conversations, less willing to engage. You may start pulling back emotionally, even if you're still physically present. Your tone might shift slightly. Your patience shortens. Small things begin to irritate you more than they should. From the outside, it can look confusing. You might not understand why you've changed because you never clearly expressed what was bothering you in the first place. But internally, it makes perfect sense. You've been carrying too much for too long without acknowledgement, without balance, and without release. And here's the key point. Resentment doesn't stay passive. If it's not addressed, it evolves. What starts as frustration can turn into detachment. What begins as disappointment can shift into distrust. And eventually, empathy that once made you open and understanding starts becoming filtered, selective, even strategic. You don't stop reading people. You just stop responding the same way. You might notice yourself holding back support because uh, you can't give it, but because part of you doesn't want to anymore. You may start choosing when to engage based on what you'll get in return, rather than offering freely like you once did. In more extreme cases, even find yourself using your understanding of others' emotions in ways that feel calculated rather than compassionate. This is how suppressed resentment transforms, not into something explosive, but into something controlled. Not what makes it so easy to miss, and so important to recognize early, because the issue was never your ability to care. It was the lack of space to express when something wasn't right. When you start acknowledging your own needs in real time, when you speak up limits and allow yourself to feel without immediately dismissing those feelings, resentment loses its foundation. It doesn't get the chance to build layer by layer into something heavier. Honesty, even in small amounts, interrupts that process. It keeps your empathy clean, connected to understanding, not weighed down by unspoken frustration. Because empathy and resentment cannot coexist for long without one reshaping the other. And if resentment is left unchecked, we'll always find a way to take what was once genuine and turn it into something guarded, distant, and far less human. Most people imagine a breaking point as something sudden. One moment everything is fine, and the next everything changes. When it comes to this kind of emotional shift, that's almost never how it happens. The transition is quiet, gradual, of small decisions that seem harmless in isolation, but become significant over time. It starts with tolerance, not the healthy kind, but the kind where you consistently allow things that don't sit right with you. You overlook comments that feel dismissive. Excuse behavior that crosses your boundaries. You stay patient in situations where you're internally uncomfortable. And each time, tell yourself a version of the same story. It's not a big deal, or they didn't mean it, or I'll just handle it. Individually, those moments feel manageable, but they don't disappear once they pass. They accumulate. Every time you tolerate something that goes against your internal standard, you create a small gap between how you feel and how you act. At first, that gap is barely noticeable. You still feel aligned with who you are. You still believe you're acting with integrity. But as those moments stack up, that gap widens. You start noticing a pattern, not necessarily in others, but in yourself. You realize you've been consistently choosing comfort over honesty, peace over clarity, and understanding over self-respect. While those choices might keep situations smooth on the surface, they create tension underneath. Things where the gradual shift begins to take shape because your mind is designed to adapt. When it sees that direct expression isn't being used, It starts finding alternative ways to manage the imbalance. You might become more observant, less reactive. You start analyzing situations instead of engaging with them emotionally. You begin predicting outcomes rather than participating authentically. At first, this feels like growth. You feel more in control, less affected by what others say or do. You're not as emotionally reactive as you used to be. And in many ways, it can be a positive development, but there's a subtle difference between emotional stability and emotional withdrawal. Stability keeps you grounded while still connected. Withdrawal creates distance, and that distance builds slowly, decision by decision. You stop sharing certain thoughts because it feels easier than explaining them. You hold back reactions because you assume they won't be understood. You choose silence not because you have nothing to say, because speaking up feels unnecessary or inefficient. Over time, this becomes your default, not reacting, not engaging, investing the same way you used to. And here's where the shift becomes more defined, because as you disengage emotionally, your awareness doesn't decrease, it sharpens. You start seeing patterns in people more clearly. You notice inconsistencies, motives, emotional triggers with greater precision. You understand not just what people are feeling, why they're feeling it, and how they're likely to act next. That awareness, combined with emotional distance, creates a new kind of mindset, is less driven by connection and more driven by control, not in an obvious or aggressive way, but in subtle, calculated decisions. You choose when to respond, how much to reveal, what to hold back. You start navigating interactions with intention rather than instinct. And because this transition happened gradually, it doesn't feel like a major change. It feels justified. You tell yourself you've simply learned, that you're protecting your energy. You're being smarter about where you invest your time and attention. And there's truth in that. But if you look closely, you'll see that this version of control was built on a foundation of unaddressed moments, times when you could have spoken up but didn't, when you could have set a boundary but chose not to, when you prioritized keeping things smooth over keeping things honest. This is why the shift feels so subtle, because at no point did you consciously decide to become distant or calculated. You simply adapted to a pattern that was never corrected. An adaptation, when left unchecked, can take you further than you intended to go. That's what makes this process predictable, not because everyone experiences it the same way, but because the steps are consistent. Not tolerate too much. Stay silent too often. Ignore internal signals long enough, and eventually your behavior will adjust to compensate. The good news is that this process works both ways. Just as small moments of avoidance can lead you toward disconnection, moments of honesty can bring you back. Saying what you actually think, even when it's uncomfortable. Comments, setting limits before resentment builds. Acknowledging when something doesn't feel right instead of dismissing it. These aren't dramatic actions. Interrupt the pattern. They close the gap between what you feel and how you act. That's what prevents the gradual shift from turning into a permanent state, because the real issue was never the change itself. It was the series of unnoticed decisions that made the change inevitable. Awareness doesn't usually arrive in a dramatic moment of clarity. It's quieter than that. It shows up as a subtle recognition that something feels off, even if you can't fully explain why. Maybe it's the way you respond differently than you used to. Maybe it's the sense that you're more guarded, more distant, more selective with your energy. Or maybe it's just a general feeling that you're no longer as connected to others or even to yourself. Most people ignore this stage. They assume it's temporary, or they justify it as growth without questioning what kind of growth it actually is. Awareness, even in its smallest form, is one of the most important signals you can pay attention to. It gives you something most people don't have in these situations: choice. Without awareness, patterns run automatically. You keep tolerating what drains you. You keep suppressing what bothers you. You keep adapting in ways that slowly move you further away from who you intended to be. And because it happens gradually, it feels normal. The moment you become aware even slightly that something is changing, you interrupt that automatic process. You create space between stimulus and response. Instead of reacting the way you always have, you start observing. You notice your own behavior in real time. You catch yourself pulling back in conversations. Recognize when you're about to say yes out of habit rather than intention. You feel the moment where you're choosing silence because it's right, but because it's easier. That awareness alone doesn't fix the problem, but it gives you leverage, because now, instead of operating on default, you can begin to make deliberate decisions. And those decisions, even small ones, looks at the chart for a second, start to shift the direction you're moving in. For example, you might start asking yourself simple questions in the moment. Actually have the capacity for this right now. Am I agreeing because I want to, or because I feel expected to? Is this something I should carry, or something I need to step back from? These questions may seem basic, but they do something powerful. They reconnect you with your own internal signals. Signals that were always there, but often ignored in favor of maintaining harmony or avoiding discomfort. As you continue paying attention, patterns become clearer. You start seeing which situations consistently drain you, which people require more energy than you can sustainably give, which environments push you in to roles that don't align with who you want to be. Instead of automatically adjusting yourself to fit those situations, you begin considering a different option, adjusting your response. This is where awareness turns into control. Not control over others, but control over your own behavior. You begin setting limits, even in small ways. You take more time before responding. You allow yourself to pause instead of immediately stepping in. You start being more honest, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. And yes, this can create friction. People who are used to a certain version of you may not immediately understand the change. They may expect the same level of availability, the same automatic understanding, the same willingness to take on emotional weight. But that's part of the process, because awareness doesn't just show you what needs to change. It often requires you to tolerate the discomfort of changing it. What makes this stage powerful is that it prevents escalation. Instead of allowing frustration to build into resentment, you address it early. Withdrawing for a second. Instead of withdrawing completely, you make adjustments while still staying connected. Instead of becoming cold or detached, you learn how to remain engaged without overextending yourself. In other words, you stay balanced. You don't lose your empathy, you refine it. Over time, something important happens. The same awareness that once showed you what was off begins to guide you toward what feels right. Develop a stronger sense of what you're willing to accept and what you're not. You become more selective, not out of bitterness, clarity. That clarity changes how you interact with the world. You're still perceptive, still understanding, still capable of reading people and situations with depth. But now that ability is grounded. It's supported by limits, by intention, by self-respect, and because of that, it becomes sustainable. Dark turn that many people fear doesn't fully take hold. Not because you avoided it, because you recognized it early enough to redirect it. That's the real value of awareness. It doesn't erase your experiences or undo what's already happened, but it gives you the ability to respond differently moving forward. It turns unconscious patterns into conscious choices. And once you have that, you're no longer reacting to your environment. You're shaping how you move through it. That's where real control begins. In shutting down your empathy, but in finally understanding how to use it without letting it use you. At the chart for a second. So here's the truth most people miss. The empath doesn't become dangerous because they feel too much. They become dangerous when they decide they've felt enough. And if you really understand that, then you see this moment differently. About fear, it about awareness. Because the same person who can read a room in seconds, who can sense what others are hiding, who knows exactly what to say and when to say it, that person doesn't need to turn cold to be powerful. They just need to stop abandoning themselves. That's the real shift, not from light to dark, but from unprotected to self-respecting. If you recognize this in yourself, don't try to shut it down, refine it. Keep the awareness, keep the emotional intelligence. Add something that changes everything. Standards. Decide who earns your energy. Decide when you step in and when you step back. Understanding others will never again come at the cost of losing control of your own direction. Because real strength isn't becoming untouchable. It's knowing you could and choosing not to. That's not darkness. That's discipline.